Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight's tale is called A Corpse at the Christmas Market, a Miss Marple mystery set in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, where winter settles softly and every house glows with the promise of celebration. Snow falls gently upon rooftops, the church bells sound across the fields, and the scent of pine and spice drifts through the air. Yet, beneath the comfort of tea and song, a quiet unease waits to be heard. Here in our story, Miss Marple sits by her small fire, her knitting close at hand. Her eyes, kind and clear, see more than the world intends to show. She listens to gossip, to footsteps in the snow, and to silence itself. For silence, she often says, speaks louder than words. Where are you listening from this evening? Perhaps by your own fire or near a window touched by rain. Wherever you are, let the warmth of this tale draw you nearer, and let each word flicker softly like candlelight. Chapter 1. Morning came pale and silver over St. Mary Mead. The snow had fallen through the night, smoothing the roofs and softening the lanes. From the vicarage to the high street, smoke lifted gently from chimneys, carrying the smell of coal and cinnamon. The village was alive with quiet excitement. It was the day of the Christmas market, a tradition as old as anyone could remember. The stalls were being set in place by mittened hands. Lanterns hung from iron hooks. Children dragged sledges laden with wreaths and holly bundles. Miss Marple walked carefully down the lane, her boots crunching on the frozen path. She wore her old grey coat and a hat trimmed with faded velvet. Her shopping basket swung lightly at her side. She greeted each passer-by with a nod, her eyes noting more than her words revealed. At the square, the market stalls formed a bright circle around the old fountain. The air smelled of nutmeg and pine. Mrs. Bantry was arranging sponge cakes beneath a red cloth. Tom Ellis, the butcher's apprentice, helped set up the parish collection box beside Reverend Clement's stall. "Careful with that, Tom," the vicar said. "The hinges are loose." Tom laughed and said it would hold. He was young and cheerful, his cheeks red with cold. Miss Marple paused near the cake stall to watch him. She liked to see how people moved when they thought no one was watching. A bell rang, and the crowd stirred. The market was open. Coins clinked, ribbons fluttered, and the sound of carols drifted from the church door. All seemed well, yet beneath the cheer there was a small unease that Miss Marple could not name. Around midday, the first whisper began. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned close to Mrs. Bantry as they examined a tray of mince pies. "Did you hear about the collection money?" she murmured. Mrs. Bantry looked alarmed. "Lost again?" "So they say. Vanished between last evening and this morning. Poor Reverend Clement can't think how." Miss Marple, standing nearby, pretended to admire a lace doily. She listened without seeming to. It was always best, she thought, to let the wind carry gossip before one tried to catch its shape. By afternoon, the story had grown. Some said a tramp had been seen near the church. Others whispered that young Tom Ellis had been careless with the key. He laughed too loudly when anyone mentioned it, which made his denial less convincing. Miss Marple found herself beside him as he arranged sausages on a tray. She smiled mildly. "Busy morning, Tom," she said. "Too busy, Miss Marple," he answered. "Hard to keep count of anything in this crowd." She nodded, her eyes resting on the gloves he wore. Sturdy, brown, and too large for his hands. A faint scent of brandy lingered when he moved. Later, at the tea tent, she joined Reverend Clement for a cup. The vicar sighed and stirred his tea slowly. "It's a small sum, but it troubles me," he said. "These things sow distrust," Miss Marple spoke softly. "A mystery among mince pies is still a mystery, Reverend." He smiled, though his worry remained. "You always see more than you admit." "Only what is there to be seen," she replied. As dusk approached, the stalls began to close. Snowflakes fell thicker now, drifting into baskets of apples and onto the shoulders of wool coats. Miss Marple watched as Tom locked the parish box and handed the key to the vicar. His hands trembled slightly. From the far end of the square, a man's voice was raised. Mr. Sykes, the merchant from Upminster, stood arguing with a stall-holder. "You'll not cheat me," he said. "I saw the money with my own eyes," the stall-holder protested, and the quarrel drew a small circle of onlookers. Miss Marple stayed back, her expression unreadable. The merchant's coat was fine but dirty at the cuff. His eyes darted nervously. She noticed the mark of an old burn on his glove. When he stormed off, she took a quiet sip of her cooling tea. Arguments, she thought, often reveal more truth than peace ever does. At last the market lights were extinguished one by one. The square grew dim. Only the church windows glowed faintly with golden light. Miss Marple walked home beneath the falling snow. She moved slowly, her thoughts turning like the flakes in the air. The lost money, the quarrel, the nervous boy, all small things, yet threads of a larger pattern she could already feel forming. At her gate, she paused to look back. The market was silent now, its stalls empty, its lights gone. Only the fountain stood still in the square, its edge rimmed with frost. She whispered softly to herself. "Every Christmas brings its own lesson." Then she entered her cottage, set down her basket, and lit the fire. The flame rose gently, steady and bright, like a question waiting for its answer. Morning passed into evening with a hush of snow upon the roofs. The church bells rang softly, their sound wrapped in mist. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting spread across her lap, and thought of the day just gone. The village always felt different after the market. Cheer lingered, but so did something quieter, like a secret too shy to be spoken. She heard footsteps outside and looked up as Mrs. Bantry tapped on the window. "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple called. Mrs. Bantry entered, brushing snow from her shawl. Her cheeks glowed from the cold, and her eyes were full of talk. "My dear Jane, have you heard the latest? They say the money wasn't stolen at all. It was borrowed for safekeeping." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Borrowed, was it? That is a hopeful word. Tom says the vicar gave him leave to move it last night. Yet the vicar says he never did. Between the two of them, someone must be mistaken." Miss Marple poured tea and listened. Mrs. Bantry spoke quickly, her words tumbling like sleigh bells. Beneath it all, Miss Marple heard the rhythm of worry, the kind that grows when truth hides among friends. When Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple returned to her chair. She stared at the fire until the shapes within it seemed to form faces. Memory is a curious thing, she thought. It often stores guilt alongside warmth. She recalled the merchant's anger, the boy's trembling hands, and the smell of brandy. Then she remembered something small, the parish box's brass latch. Earlier, when Tom had locked it, the hinge had caught slightly. She wondered if that tiny hesitation might matter later. Outside, the snow thickened. Somewhere in the lane, a cart rolled past, its wheels muffled. The church clock struck 8. At that hour, most of St. Mary Mead settled into comfort. Windows glowed with lamplight. Supper dishes clattered faintly. Yet Miss Marple knew that calm often arrived just before trouble. She folded her knitting and stood. She crossed to the window and looked toward the market square. Through the veil of snow she could just make out the fountain. A faint movement caught her eye, someone crossing the square alone. A figure in a long coat, head bent, hands hidden. The figure stopped at the parish stall where the collection box still stood beneath its canvas cover. For a moment nothing moved. Then, as if feeling her gaze, the person turned and vanished into the narrow lane by the baker's shop. Miss Marple let the curtain fall. Curiosity is best saved until morning, she told herself. Still, her thoughts refused to rest. The next day dawned cold and pale. Miss Marple went early to church, her breath visible in the air. Constable Jenkins was there already, stamping his feet for warmth. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "Market Square's a picture today, though I'd not linger long. Strange business last night. Someone said they saw a man about after dark." "Oh?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Could have been that merchant fellow. Mr. Sykes seemed to be looking for something near the fountain." Miss Marple said nothing. She only glanced toward the place where snow lay unevenly over the cobbles. The pattern of footprints caught her attention, some fresh, some older, yet one set led from the parish stall to the fountain and stopped abruptly. Later, she attended morning service. The vicar spoke kindly, his voice echoing under the rafters. He prayed for peace among neighbours and patience among the hasty. Miss Marple listened, her gaze resting on the stained glass window. The light through it was soft and red, like wine in winter sun. After the service, Tom Ellis approached her. He looked pale and tired. "Miss Marple," he said, "you don't think they mean to blame me, do you?" "It was only a few shillings and I never took them." She looked at him gently. "When truth hides, Tom, it sometimes chooses the nearest heart to sit upon. Best to tell all you know." He hesitated. "There was someone at the market late after closing."
I thought it was the merchant.
"I didn't say because I wasn't sure." "Then you must tell the constable," she said. He nodded, though fear still clouded his face. That afternoon, the snow eased. Miss Marple visited the square again, her steps slow. The stalls stood empty now, their decorations damp and drooping. Near the fountain, something dark showed beneath a drift of snow. She bent carefully and brushed it aside. It was a glove, singed at the edge. She held it for a moment, then tucked it into her basket. A small thing, yet it carried the scent she remembered from the merchant's quarrel, brandy and smoke. Evening came early. By lamplight she examined the glove once more. The burn mark was shaped oddly, as though from a candle flame. She thought of the market lights, the quarrel, the footsteps, and the quiet pause before the fountain. It was not yet a puzzle, but the pieces were waiting. Miss Marple set the glove aside and drew her shawl tighter. Outside the snow began again, soft and soundless. Somewhere beyond the quiet, she sensed that the story of the lost money was not finished. Chapter 2. Morning light fell pale through the church windows. Frost traced the glass like white fern. The nave smelled of pine and cold stone. Miss Marple walked in with a steady step. She carried a small tin of barley sweets for sore throats. The choir gathered in coats and scarves. Breath rose in faint clouds as voices warmed. Mr. Avery tapped his baton on the lectern. He was a neat man with careful hair. His spectacles sat very straight. Beside him stood Elsie Trent with a stack of carol sheets. Reverend Clement checked the stove in the vestry. The stove gave little heat and much complaint. Miss Marple sat near the back and watched in quiet comfort. They began with "Once in Royal David's City." The first note wavered, then settled like a bird. Mrs. Price Ridley sang with brisk certainty. Mr. Avery nodded with reserved approval. Elsie glanced toward the aisle with quick eyes. Miss Marple let the music wash over her, calm and observant. During the pause, the door opened and closed again. The cold advanced like a polite guest. Mrs. Bantry slipped in with a smile and a parcel. She sat beside Miss Marple and drew off her gloves. Her cheeks were bright from the walk. "News travels faster than snow," she said. "They say the lost money has been found." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Found, has it? And where did it rest its head?" "By the fountain, they say," Mrs. Bantry answered. "Tucked in a cloth bag under the rim." Miss Marple considered this with a mild look. "Fountains often catch what the night lets fall." "Tom insists he knows nothing," Mrs. Bantry said. "Mr. Avery says we should rehearse and not chatter." They rose for "Hark, the herald angels sing." The organ coughed, then gave a proper tone. Children shuffled near the front pew. A thin boy rubbed his hands for warmth. Elsie passed along the carol sheets and smiled at him. Miss Marple noted how the gossip settled into the music. Faces that had tensed now eased, yet small signs remained, and she gathered them with care. Mr. Avery avoided the aisle with the loose flagstone. Mrs. Price Ridley watched Elsie with a narrow gaze. Reverend Clement folded a letter into his prayer book. The hymn ended, and the choir broke into groups. Someone laughed about the market snowman. Someone asked for extra song sheets. Miss Marple offered barley sweets to a hoarse tenor. He thanked her with shy relief and coughed again. A choir boy brought a bundle of found items from the market. A glove, a ribbon, and a small brass key. Constable Jenkins had asked the choir to identify them. The items lay on a blue cloth by the vestry door. Miss Marple walked by them with mild interest. She paused, then looked closer at the key. It was plain and worn at the teeth. A loop of green thread was tied to its head. The thread held a crust of wax near the knot. She turned away and said nothing yet. The small clue rested like a seed in winter soil. Mr. Avery called them back to order. The next carol was Coventry Carol in a slow measure. The harmony rose soft and spare. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment. She liked the old tune with its patient sorrow. When she opened her eyes, Elsie was near the lectern. Elsie whispered to Mr. Avery about the lost purse. He frowned, then waved it away with tired grace. The girl flushed and stared at her music. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned toward a friend with a quick remark. The friend nodded with pleased concern. Miss Marple saw the gesture and filed it quietly. Reverend Clement stepped forward with a word. He thanked the choir for their time and spirit. He mentioned the found money in a gentle tone. His hope was for calm and trust. His eyes rested on the younger faces with care. After a short break, the choir prepared for "O Come All Ye Faithful." Elsie bent to tie a loose shoe. A folded note slipped from her coat pocket. It landed near Miss Marple's foot. Miss Marple picked it up with a simple motion. "Yours, my dear," she said. Elsie blushed and reached for it. The note smelled faintly of brandy and spice. Miss Marple felt the scent before Elsie hid the paper. The girl tucked it away with a small shake. "Thank you," Elsie said. "You are quite welcome," Miss Marple replied. The music began again with a stronger sound. The tenor found his pitch and held it clean. Mrs. Price Ridley softened her volume after a pointed look. Mr. Avery beamed at the final chord. He dismissed them for a short pause. In the quiet, Mrs. Bantry opened her parcel. She had brought sugared almonds for the sopranos. She offered some to Miss Marple with a smile. Miss Marple accepted one and let it melt. The almond was crisp and sweet. It left a whisper of rose in the mouth. Constable Jenkins entered from the side door. He carried a notebook with damp edges. He greeted Reverend Clement with polite care. He spoke low about the money and the fountain. He asked whether any choir keys had gone astray. Mr. Avery said no with firm diction. Mrs. Price Ridley agreed with brisk assurance. Elsie looked down at her shoes and was silent. Miss Marple watched the girl without pressure. Silence speaks like a small bell in winter air. Jenkins showed the brass key on the blue cloth. The green thread caught the light and the wax crumb. Reverend Clement shook his head in real puzzlement. He said the parish box used a different key. His key was iron with a square bow. Miss Marple considered the wax and the thread. She thought of the market candles in glass jars. She thought of the singed glove found in the snow. She thought of brandy near a raised voice. Each thought sat in its place without haste. The constable turned to go and paused. He asked if anyone had been near the fountain late. Mr. Avery said he left just after 7. Mrs. Bantry said she walked home with Miss Marple. Elsie spoke at last in a steady tone. "I passed the square at 7:30, she said. "I saw a man by the fountain." "Which man?" Jenkins asked. "I could not see his face," she said. "He wore a long coat and a hat. Was he looking down at the water?" Jenkins asked. "He was kneeling by the rim," she said. "That is helpful," Jenkins said. Miss Marple studied Elsie's hands as the girl spoke. One finger had a tiny burn near the nail. The skin was puckered in a faint crescent. It looked fresh and tender in the cold light. Miss Marple stored the sight with patience and calm. The choir gathered coats and music. The rehearsal would close after one last hymn. Reverend Clement chose in the bleak midwinter. He smiled at their groans and raised his hands. The first verse rose like breath on glass. Miss Marple listened with a thoughtful stillness. She felt the lines settle against the morning. The words spoke of gifts and simple hearts. She glanced at the vestry door in the blue cloth. The brass key sat quiet beside the ribbon. The small clue no longer felt lonely. The hymn ended in a gentle sigh. Mr. Avery declared them prepared for the service. He thanked them with a neat bow. People drifted out in pairs and threes. Boots squeaked faintly on the stone floor. The door admitted once more the thin winter light. Miss Marple remained in her pew for a minute. She looked toward the choir stalls in the aisle. She rose at last and walked to the vestry. She touched the frayed green thread with one finger. The wax flaked softly and left a pale mark. She wiped it on her glove and turned to go. Jenkins stood nearby and looked uncertain. Miss Marple gave him a mild nod. "Candles drip where hands hesitate," she said. "The wax tells a simple tale." He blinked at her in mild confusion. "I will make a note," he said. "You will find it useful," she said. She stepped into the chill air and drew her scarf close. Snow creaked underfoot as she crossed the churchyard. The sky held a low light like pewter. In the hedges, sparrows made tiny sounds. The village lay ahead with its narrow lanes and talk. Miss Marple walked on with careful ease and quiet thought. The rehearsal ended, and footsteps faded into the cold corridor. Miss Marple lingered by the porch, fastening her coat with slow fingers. Outside, the snow had begun again, light as dust. The sky hung low and still. She watched the choir drift away in twos and threes, their voices dimming behind the hedge. Reverend Clement joined her at the door. His breath steamed in the air. "A good practice," he said. "Yet there's unease about this matter of the found purse." "I fear it troubles the young ones." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Youth feels guilt even when it is blameless. It wishes to tidy the world before it understands the dust." He looked tired. "Craddock will call tomorrow." "I hope we have no cause for shame among our own." She nodded and stepped into the lane. The snow squeaked underfoot, the sound small and constant. From the church tower came the slow fall of a bell marking the hour. Each note felt round and clear in the cold. Halfway home, she paused beside the bakery. A candle burned in the window behind the frosted glass. Inside, Tom Ellis swept the floor. He looked up and smiled, though his shoulders were stiff with care. She raised a hand in greeting. Later, at her cottage, she set her basket down and lit the hearth. The flame took gently, and the scent of wood filled the room. She poured herself tea, adding a thin slice of lemon. The glove from the market still lay on her table. Beside it, she placed the image of the brass key in her mind. Both small, both careless, both tied by wax and flame. She thought of the girl's burn, the merchant's anger, the fountain. In every story, she told herself, there are patterns like stitches on cloth. The wrong thread always shows. That night snow fell harder. The village was quiet, except for the wind between the chimneys. Miss Marple read by lamplight until her eyes grew heavy. Outside, faint footprints marked the lane and then were covered again. At dawn, a knock came at her door. Constable Jenkins stood there, his cap dusted white. "Morning, Miss Marple. Sorry to trouble you." "Reverend Clement asked me to call." "Do come in," she said, motioning toward the fire. He entered awkwardly and stamped his boots. "There's talk that the stranger who bought holly at the market may not have left the village. The vicar says you notice things others don't." "I notice what lingers," she said. "What do you seek?" "We found footprints near the fountain again, smaller than before, lighter. The same pattern as last night, maybe." She poured him tea and sat opposite. "Was the brass key still where you left it?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Gone this morning." Miss Marple stirred her cup once. "And the wax?" "Bits of it on the stone by the water." She nodded. "Then someone still hides in plain sight." He blinked, unsure. "You mean the thief?" "Perhaps not the thief alone," she said gently. When he left, she stood by the window for a long time. The sun was weak, no more than a pale coin behind the clouds. She saw Elsie hurry past toward the church, her scarf flapping. The girl's coat looked thin against the wind. By afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the church herself. Inside, the choir stalls stood empty, their music left in neat piles. She traced a finger over one sheet and found a wax mark near the margin. The scent of smoke still clung to it. Mr. Avery entered with his careful step. "Miss Marple," he said, surprised. "You startled me." "Forgive me," she said. "I was admiring the order." He smiled faintly. "One must keep things in place. Disorder invites gossip." She looked at him with quiet kindness. "And yet gossip is a sort of order too. It fills the gaps between truths." He said nothing more. She watched him gather the sheets with slow precision. His cuffs were clean, but his fingers carried faint candle soot. Outside, the air had turned sharp again. The lane glittered with frost. Mrs. Bantry called from across the road, waving a folded letter. "Jane, have you heard? They think the dead man by the holly stall was a traveller from Upminster. Lodged at the inn 2 nights before the market." "A traveller?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. with parish papers in his pocket. Mrs. Bantry frowned. How would you know that? I heard it from the snow, Miss Marple said. It keeps all manner of secrets. That evening, she wrote a short note to Inspector Craddock. The wax, the glove, the key, and the silence form one line. Watch who lights the candles at choir practice. She folded the note and sent it by the postboy. Then she returned to her chair. Her needles clicked softly in the lamplight. The kettle sang once and fell quiet. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked toward the window. In its reflection she saw her own face framed by firelight. Age had taught her that truth arrives not in haste, but in patience. Somewhere beyond the hedge, a dog barked once and fell silent. Snow began again, gentle and without wind. The village would sleep soundly tonight, though beneath its calm a faint unease breathed still. She looked once more at the glove on her table. The burn mark caught the light like a wink. She smiled faintly and drew the curtain. In St. Mary Mead, the choir would sing again tomorrow. Voices would rise clean and sweet, and yet beneath them a whisper would remain. Chapter 3. The next morning opened still and grey. Snow lay deep in the square, unbroken except for a few paths made by early feet. Miss Marple rose before dawn, her habit of wakefulness serving her once again. She drew back the curtain and saw the fountain rim bright with frost. It glittered faintly, like a glass bell in the cold. By 8 o'clock, the piece had ended. Constable Jenkins came running through the lane, his shout carried by the wind. The church bell had not yet begun its hour when another sound rang out, sharp and human, a cry from the square. Miss Marple put on her coat and bonnet and stepped out at once. Villagers gathered near the fountain, their breath clouding in the still air. The snow there was marked by scuffled prints and a dark stain spreading from beneath the holly stall. The stall itself leaned to one side, its garland half buried. A man lay beneath it. His coat was fine but travel-stained. His gloves were missing. His hat had rolled toward the frozen pool. Constable Jenkins crouched beside the body, his face grave. "Mr. Sykes," Mrs. Bantry whispered. "The merchant from Upminster." "Seems so," Jenkins said. No sign of struggle beyond the snow. Reverend Clement arrived a moment later, his breath short, his cassock flapping in the wind. "Dear heaven," he said softly. Miss Marple stepped closer. Her eyes followed the small things, the pressed holly leaves, the neat arrangement of the man's hands, the broken twine near his pocket. She did not touch, but she looked long and carefully. "Was anyone here before dawn?" she asked. "No one," Jenkins said. The baker opened first, just after 7. He saw nothing but snow. Mrs. Price Ridley crossed herself. "Such a thing at Christmas," she murmured. Inspector Craddock arrived before noon, his coat dusted white. His manner was brisk but not unkind. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod. "You are here again, I see. You always appear when sense is most needed." "Habit, perhaps," she said gently. He looked down at the body. "He's been dead some hours, I think. No blood, no wound, yet the cold alone would not do it. We'll have to see." Miss Marple said nothing, but her gaze rested on the holly leaves. Beneath them, one lay flattened and darkened by moisture. She bent slightly and studied the mark it made against the man's coat. The leaves were crushed, not fallen. "Inspector," she said quietly, "you might look at the pocket on his right side." He crouched and drew back the coat flap. A small envelope lay there, damp but legible. Inside was a torn note in faded ink. "Meet me after service." "By the fountain." The inspector looked at her. "How did you know?" "I did not," she said. "But Holly has a way of pointing to what is hidden." He smiled slightly. "You make riddles sound like common sense." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Observation is often mistaken for prophecy." By midday the square was cleared. The body was carried to the inn under a sheet of rough linen. Villagers spoke in low voices, their breath white in the air. Some said robbery. Others whispered revenge. At the vicarage, tea was poured for those who helped. Miss Marple sat by the window, her cup untouched. The holly wreath on the table gave off a faint scent of sap. Reverend Clement sighed. "It is dreadful," he said. "A stranger dying in our midst. Yet one must wonder why he was here. Perhaps not a stranger to all." Miss Marple said softly. He looked up.
Do you think someone knew him?
Someone always knows, she said. Mrs. Bantry entered then, her face pale.
They say he carried a parish badge from St. Mary Mead in his pocket. How could that be?
The vicar frowned. None of ours are missing. Miss Marple sipped her tea at last. Badges can travel like words, she said. They attach themselves where they are least expected. The room fell silent. Outside, a child's laughter echoed faintly through the cold air. That evening, Miss Marple returned home. The snow had thickened again, covering all prints. She paused by her gate and looked toward the square. Only the fountain showed a darker ring where the ice had melted slightly. She thought of the crushed holly, the missing gloves, the merchant's last note. Inside, she wrote a line in her small notebook. Holly pressed, flat, not fallen.
Meeting by fountain.
Gloves absent. Wax and key yet to return. She closed the book and placed it beside her knitting. The fire burned low, steady and quiet. Through the stillness, the clock on her mantel ticked softly, each second a calm reminder that truth, once hidden, will not sleep forever. She drew her shawl close and sat listening to the snow touch the window pane. Somewhere in the distance a bell began to ring, and in that sound she felt the story of the market change shape, from gossip to something grave, something human. Inspector Craddock remained at the inn, his men moving in quiet rhythm. Outside the day grew dim and the frost thickened on every ledge. Miss Marple waited near the fire, her knitting untouched. The faint smell of pine drifted through the door each time it opened. Constable Jenkins entered, his boots heavy with snow. No sign of the man's belongings beyond what you saw, he said, except for one glove half burnt found behind the stall. Miss Marple looked up. The right or left? The right, he said. Ah, she murmured. Then the left was lost before, he frowned.
You think the fire mark matters? Fires mark only what hands fear to drop, she said.
Find where the other burned thing hides. He blinked and turned to his work again. By late afternoon, Reverend Clement arrived at the inn. He stood by the door, his breath misting. Craddock, he said quietly. Our poor merchant, was it robbery? Too tidy for that, the inspector answered. His purse was full. No weapon, no wound.
I'd say he died from something he drank or breathed. Miss Marple listened, her eyes on the window frost.
Brandy, perhaps, she said softly. Craddock looked at her. You think it poisoned him?
I think it quieted him, she said.
And whoever gave it meant no noise. He wrote something in his notebook. Oh, you keep giving me lines that read like sermons, she smiled. Then you might take them to heart. That evening Miss Marple walked home alone. The snow glowed faintly blue under the moon. She passed the square again, now silent. The holly stall was gone, only the pattern of its frame remained. Beside the fountain, she noticed something small, a single sprig of holly, bent double under ice. She lifted it gently, then laid it back. When she reached her cottage, she lit the lamp and made tea. Her room filled with steady light. She wrote another line in her notebook, right glove burned. Brandy scent. Death tidy. No struggle. Holly pressed flat. Later, she heard a knock at her door. It was Mrs. Bantry, shawl tight about her shoulders. Jane, you'll never rest, but I had to tell you. Elsie's missing from the choir practice. She was due at Mrs. Price Ridley's an hour ago. Did she say where she meant to go? Only that she had a message to deliver. Miss Marple stood and reached for her coat. Messages travel farther than their senders, she said. We should go. They walked through the narrow lane, snow crunching beneath their feet. The church loomed ahead, its doors shut, its windows dark. The wind moved through the trees, whispering like a hymn. At the side door they found footprints leading toward the vestry. Miss Marple knelt and brushed the snow aside. The prints were small, neat, and recent. She followed them to the fountain's edge. There, on the stone lip, lay a candle stub, half melted, and beside it, a scrap of green thread. Mrs. Bantry drew a quick breath.
That's the same thread the constable had on that key. Yes, Miss Marple said. And the same wax. They stood in silence.
Then Miss Marple turned toward the lane.
Best not to call out.
The truth answers softly. A shadow moved beyond the gate. Tom Ellis appeared, hatless and pale. Miss Marple, he said, voice low. They're saying Elsie's in trouble, but she didn't do anything.
I swear she didn't. Miss Marple's eyes met his. You've seen her then?
He hesitated. She came to the butcher's early, said she needed a light for a candle. Looked frightened. Mrs. Bantry clutched her shawl.
Oh, poor girl, Miss Marple spoke quietly.
Fear makes us careless. We must find her before fear finds someone else. They returned to the church. Inside, the vestry smelled faintly of wax and cold stone. Miss Marple lifted a lantern from the shelf and lit it. The small flame trembled. On the floor near the lectern lay a damp handkerchief. She picked it up and felt the scent of brandy once more. "Tom," she said softly, "fetch the constable." When Jenkins arrived, he followed her gaze toward the pulpit. Behind it, half hidden by the curtain, was a small door leading to the choir loft. It stood ajar. He pushed it open and raised his lamp. Elsie sat on the step, head bowed, hands clasped around a candle. Her eyes were red from tears. "Please," she said, "I didn't mean to hurt him."
I only gave him the drink because he asked. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Tell us, my dear." "He came after service," the girl whispered.
"Said he was cold. I brought brandy from the vestry to warm him."
"He said he'd meet someone by the fountain. I left him there." "And the candle?"
Miss Marple asked. "I used it to see the way."
"It dripped on the key when I locked up." "That's all," Miss Marple nodded slowly.
"Then you have seen only part of the truth. The rest lies in whose hand poured the glass before you took it." The constable looked at her in puzzlement, but she said no more. She took the girl's hand and led her toward the door. Outside, the snow had stopped. The moonlight lay pure on the church roof. Miss Marple breathed deeply, the air sharp and still. "The cold hides nothing," she said to herself. "It preserves what warmth leaves behind." She walked home in silence, her lantern swinging beside her. The village slept, unaware that one truth had risen and another still waited beneath the frost. At her gate, she paused and looked once more toward the square. The fountain glimmered faintly, a circle of ice and shadow. Somewhere within that quiet shape, the heart of the mystery still turned unseen. Chapter 4. The morning after the discovery, snow fell again, finer and quieter than before. The village moved slowly, its roofs thick with white. Miss Marple walked to the vicarage with a parcel under her arm. Inside was a small jar of plum jam and a thought she wished to share. Reverend Clement met her at the door.
"Come in, Miss Marple," he said.
"You will find the kettle already thinking of you," she smiled. "The kettle and I have long understood one another." The vicarage smelled of wood smoke and baking. Mrs. Clement moved gently between table and hearth. A plate of shortbread cooled beside the teapot. The window showed only a curtain of falling snow. Inspector Craddock sat in the corner, his notebook on his knee. His coat hung by the fire, steaming faintly. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "We were just talking about you." "Then I shall tread carefully," she said, setting down her parcel. He smiled. "The girl, Elsie, told us her part. It seems she fetched brandy for the merchant, but never saw what followed. The bottle from the vestry was half gone." Miss Marple nodded. "Brandy again? A kind friend to many and a silent partner to deceit." The vicar poured tea into thick china cups.
"You think someone else used it?" "I think someone else prepared it," she said softly.
"And chose the moment for another hand to serve it." Mrs. Clement handed round the shortbread. "Poor Elsie was in tears all evening. She says she only wished to help him. Help and harm often share a cup," Miss Marple said. "Did you happen to notice, Reverend, which of your decanters was filled last week?" He frowned. "The large one, I believe. Mrs. Price Ridley sent it as a gift for the choir." "Ah," Miss Marple said. "Her gifts have a way of arriving at the right door, but for the wrong reason." Craddock looked up. "Do you think she had a hand in it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think she has a hand in every conversation that follows," the vicar sighed. "The merchant must have known someone here. He carried that note after all." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "A meeting by the fountain is not a stranger's thought. It belongs to a place that remembers him." Craddock leaned forward. "You believe the death was planned?" "Planned, perhaps, but not by one mind alone," she said. "Fear often borrows courage from another." He tapped his pencil. "We'll find that other in time." Miss Marple took her tea, her eyes on the rim of the cup. One edge was chipped, showing the clay beneath the glaze. She set it beside another cup, perfect, spotless, and new. She asked quietly, "Who washed these?" Mrs. Clement smiled. "I did, of course. The chipped one belongs to my husband. He keeps it for comfort. The other is for guests, Miss Marple nodded.
And yet the chipped one was poured first. The vicar looked surprised. How could you know?
The tea in mine cooled faster, she said gently. It was poured after the pot had stood a moment.
A small thing, but such things tell order, Craddock smiled.
You turn tea into testimony, Miss Marple. Everything speaks, Inspector, she said. One only has to listen to tone, not volume. The snow deepened outside, muting the village sounds. They spoke of the market, of the stolen funds now found, of the traveller's strange visit. Reverend Clement read aloud the note found in the dead man's pocket. Meet me after service. By the fountain. No name, only the handwriting, firm but hurried. Miss Marple looked at the script. Not a man's hand, she said.
A woman's, writing quickly but with care.
The downward strokes leaned to the left. Mrs. Clement peered closer.
Could it be Elsie's?
Miss Marple shook her head.
Too controlled.
Elsie writes with round letters. This belongs to someone who practices neatness as a shield. Craddock jotted a line. That narrows it to half the parish. Half is plenty, Miss Marple said. They sat in a companionable silence for a time. The fire clicked softly in the grate. From outside came the muffled sound of a cart passing over snow. Mrs. Clement broke the quiet. Will there be a service for him? Yes, said Reverend Clement. We cannot turn away the dead, Miss Marple folded her hands. Death, like charity, must be offered without question. Craddock stood and closed his notebook. I'll speak with Mrs. Price Ridley this afternoon. Perhaps she can tell us how her gift reached the vestry shelf. Miss Marple rose and reached for her coat. Be gentle when you ask. Her pride bruises easily, the inspector smiled. I'll step as soft as your reasoning, ma'am, she smiled back. Then the snow will forgive your footprints. Outside the air was brighter though still cold. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane, her mind turning with the rhythm of her steps. The chipped cup, the neat handwriting, the half-emptied bottle, all spoke quietly to one another. She did not yet know their full meaning, but she heard their whisper. At the gate to the churchyard, she paused. A robin hopped on the wall, its breast bright against the snow. She watched it tilt its head as if in question. Patience, she said softly, and the crumbs will appear. The robin fluttered away toward the vicarage roof. Miss Marple smiled and went home, her thoughts tidy as her steps. Evening settled early, the snow turning to silver beneath the gas lamps. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple sat before the hearth. The warmth brushed her cheeks, though her thoughts remained elsewhere. On the table before her lay three things: a chipped cup, a torn note, and a sprig of dried holly. She had borrowed the cup from the vicarage, saying she would mend it. That was partly true. What she wished was to look again at the faint ring around its rim, darker than tea alone could make. She traced the mark with her fingertip. It was sticky, faintly sweet.
Not honey, not sugar.
Brandy residue, she thought, softened with lemon peel. The kettle hissed once on the hob. She poured herself tea and sat again, gazing through the window at the white world beyond. The quiet was complete, save for the wind tapping lightly at the glass. When she closed her eyes, she heard voices from the afternoon, the vicar's concern, Craddock's careful tone, Mrs. Clement's anxious kindness. Each voice carried its own key, its own shade of truth. A knock came at the door. It was Constable Jenkins, cap in hand. He looked cold and uncertain. Evening, Miss Marple, he said.
Inspector asked me to tell you.
We spoke with Mrs. Price Ridley. She says she never sent that bottle herself.
Said it was arranged through her housekeeper. Her housekeeper, Miss Marple repeated.
That would be Mrs. Sims, a helpful soul with a tidy conscience. Yes, ma'am, said a tradesman fetched it for her. She never learned his name, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Tradesmen often pass through with empty hands and full pockets. He shifted on his feet. Inspector thinks the merchant came to collect money owed. Maybe blackmail. Hard to say yet. Nothing is hard to say, only hard to hear, she said gently. Thank you, Constable.
You've brought warmth enough with your errand. He blushed slightly and left.
Miss Marple closed the door, then returned to her chair. She took up her knitting but found her hands idle. Her mind drifted back to the market, to Tom Ellis's trembling gloves and to Elsie's frightened eyes. At 9 o'clock, the church bell sounded across the snow. Its note spread slowly through the village, steady and low. In its rhythm, Miss Marple felt something align. She rose, fetched her notebook and opened it. Brandy lemon cup from vicarage. Housekeeper, messenger, merchant from Upminster.
Purpose still hidden, she wrote another line beneath it. Gift bottles travel on trusted errands.
1 bottle, 2 hands, 3 sips. Her pencil paused. She looked toward the window again. Beyond the curtain, faint lamplight touched the snow in small golden pools. She thought of Mrs. Clement's remark. The chipped cup belonged to her husband, always poured first. And yet, at tea that day, the unchipped cup had been poured first. That simple reversal had caught Miss Marple's attention more than any confession could. She knew patterns, and when one reversed itself, she listened. Someone else had poured that tea before they arrived. Someone careful enough to switch cups, perhaps to test the strength of what had been mixed. By morning, the frost had sealed the windows. Miss Marple walked to the church again, her shawl pulled close. Inside, the vicar prepared for evening prayers. He greeted her kindly. "You must be frozen, Miss Marple. Will you sit by the stove?"
"Only a moment," she said. "I came to return your cup," he smiled.
"It's not worth the trouble." "Worth more than you think," she said softly.
"That mark upon its rim, do you recall when last you drank from it?"
He frowned. "Why, yesterday morning after breakfast. And not again since?" "No, Mrs. Clement washed it for tea." Miss Marple nodded.
"Then it must have been poured again without your knowing."
"Someone in this house used it when you were away." The vicar looked startled. "Who would do such a thing?" "Same person who refilled your brandy bottle, perhaps." He looked at her with sudden comprehension. "Mrs. Price Ridley's gift?" "Not hers in truth," Miss Marple said. "Someone else sent it in her name." That bottle carried more than warmth. Inspector Craddock entered then, his boots leaving small pools of melt upon the floor. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, "I see you've begun before me." "I was only mending a cup," she said mildly. He gave a half smile. Mrs. Sims remembered something. The tradesman who fetched the brandy wore gloves both burned at the fingertips. Miss Marple met his gaze. Then our merchant was not alone in deceit. He received his poison from a familiar hand. "You mean the same man who took the collection money?"
"Perhaps not."
"But the same motive. Guilt seldom travels alone," Craddock sighed. "You speak in riddles again," she smiled. "No riddle, Inspector."
"Only a pattern yet unfinished." He closed his notebook.
"You believe we'll find the truth soon?" She looked toward the window where snow fell quietly against the glass. "Truth is patient. It waits at the hearth until all the tea is cooled." Craddock nodded. "Then we'll keep it warm a little longer." Miss Marple gathered her shawl and rose to leave. "You may find your next clue in the post office," she said. "Letters tell stories even their writers forget." Outside, the snow had softened into flakes that clung to the air before falling. The village lamps burned like tiny suns. As she walked home, she felt the case settling into shape, not yet solved, but breathing quietly, as mysteries do before they speak. At her gate, she paused and looked back toward the vicarage. Its windows glowed like small fires. She thought again of the chipped cup, the brandy, the housekeeper, and the merchant with his empty promise. Then she whispered, almost kindly, "Even good people sometimes pour from the wrong bottle." The wind carried the words away. She entered her house, laid aside her coat, and stirred the fire. The kettle began to hum. Chapter 5. The next morning arrived clear and pale, the snow frozen firm underfoot. St. Mary Mead stirred slowly awake, its chimneys breathing faintly in the still air. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley sorted envelopes beside a small heater that did little against the chill. Miss Marple entered quietly, her coat buttoned high, her basket neat on her arm. "Good morning, Mrs. Price Ridley," she said. "I thought to collect my parcel from Bath." Mrs. Price Ridley nodded without looking up. "You're early, Miss Marple. The post's not been long in." "So much to do, even with the frost," Miss Marple smiled. "Christmas brings more words than gifts, I think." "Letters are dangerous things," the woman replied. "They keep what the tongue should never say." Miss Marple rested her hand on the counter. "And yet they travel faster than forgiveness." From the back room came Tom Ellis, arms full of mailbags. His hair was damp with melting snow. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, setting down the sacks. "Train from Upminster was late."
Rails iced over again, she nodded. Ah, Upminster.
"It seems that place follows us this week," he laughed nervously. "Only in parcels, I hope." Mrs. Price Ridley began stamping envelopes with brisk precision.
There's talk again about the dead man, she said.
Some say he had letters with him.
Unsent ones.
Addressed to no one. "Curious," Miss Marple said. "Words without a listener always seek a reader." Tom cleared his throat.
Inspector Craddock asked me to bring one to him.
"It was found in the snow near the inn. The corner's torn, but you can still see part of the name." He held out an envelope sealed in brown paper. The ink was blurred, but Miss Marple caught the faint curve of a familiar hand. "May I look?" she asked. Tom hesitated, then nodded. "Just for a moment. It's to be given to the inspector later." She studied it briefly. The handwriting leaned left, the strokes narrow and deliberate. The same hand as the note found in the dead man's pocket. "Thank you, Tom," she said softly. "You've brought more than the post this morning." He flushed and turned to fetch another bundle. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "The young are too easily tangled in grown affairs." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but the young often deliver truth without knowing its address." She left the post office and walked toward the square. The snow was crisp, the air sharp with frost. Across the road, Inspector Craddock stood speaking to Constable Jenkins. He raised a hand in greeting. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've just come from the station." "The coroner confirms it. Poisoned brandy." "No question now," she nodded. "A quiet death, then. Not the work of hate, but of arrangement." He frowned. "You mean planned?" "Yes. Planned with calm hands." They walked together along the lane toward the church. "We've traced the bottle," he said. "The merchant bought it in Upminster last week, but the cork doesn't match the shop's mark."
"Someone changed it," Miss Marple stopped.
"So the bottle travelled twice, once to him, once back." "That's about it," he said. "We'll find who handled it soon." Inside the church, the air was still and faintly scented with wax. Mrs. Clement was arranging candles for the evening lantern walk. The market stalls would light again that night, though quietly now, in memory of the man who had died. "Good morning," she said. "Would you like to help, Miss Marple? These ribbons seem to have a will of their own." "With pleasure," Miss Marple said. They worked side by side in silence for a while. Then Mrs. Clement spoke softly. "The inspector asked if anyone borrowed ink or paper from the vestry last week."
"I found one torn sheet missing." "Ah," Miss Marple said.
"The letter in the snow, perhaps?" Mrs. Clement nodded.
"You think it was written here?"
"I think it began here," Miss Marple replied, "but perhaps it ended elsewhere." The church door creaked open. Tom entered, his hat in his hands. "Beg pardon," he said.
"Inspector asked if I could help carry lanterns to the square." Miss Marple looked at him kindly.
"You seem often called to carry things, Tom." He smiled weakly. "Better than standing still." He bent to lift a box, and as he did, a small envelope slipped from his pocket. Mrs. Clement picked it up.
"You've dropped something." "Oh," he said quickly, "just a note from the vicar." "Nothing important." But Miss Marple's eyes saw more.
The corner bore the faintest trace of sealing wax, pale and green, the same shade that had tied the brass key. When Tom had gone, Mrs. Clement whispered, "He looked frightened." "Fear," Miss Marple said, "is often the messenger of honesty." Afternoon passed into evening. The lanterns were hung along the square, their light soft against the snow. Villagers gathered in quiet groups. No music, only murmurs and the sound of boots. Miss Marple stood by the fountain. The water beneath the ice caught the glow of the lamps like trapped stars. She watched Inspector Craddock move among the people, his breath visible in the cold. "Strange night for celebration," he said when he joined her. "All nights are strange when truth walks near," she said. He glanced around. "You believe one of them knows more than they admit." "I believe they all do," she said. "Each holds a corner of the same letter." The bells began to ring for evening prayer. Miss Marple folded her hands inside her muff and closed her eyes a moment. When she opened them again, she saw a figure standing apart from the crowd, a woman in dark shawl and veil, her face turned away. "She was there before," Miss Marple whispered.
"At the market, near the holly stall." Craddock followed her gaze.
"You know her?"
"Not yet," Miss Marple said.
"But the night is long, and lanterns reveal more than daylight sometimes allows." The woman moved slowly toward the church door. Her gloved hand trembled slightly as she lifted her skirt from the snow. Miss Marple watched until the door closed behind her, and then she turned back to the fountain, where a faint green glimmer shone beneath the ice. The service ended early that evening. People left the church in pairs, their lanterns swaying gently. The square glowed like a dream half remembered, its light soft and golden on the snow. Miss Marple waited near the fountain until the last hymn faded into the air. Only a few figures lingered: Inspector Craddock, Constable Jenkins, and the veiled woman who stood by the lich gate. When the others turned toward the inn, Miss Marple walked quietly to the woman's side. "A cold night to stand alone," she said kindly. The woman's hands clutched her shawl. "I prefer the quiet." Her voice was low, controlled, but trembled at the edge. "You were at the market," Miss Marple said. "By the holly stall." The woman's head turned slightly. "I only came for wreaths, nothing more." Miss Marple studied her face in the lantern light. She saw grief there, but also something firmer, a secret tightly held. "The dead man," Miss Marple said gently, "was from Upminster, was he not?" The woman nodded once.
"My brother." "I see," Miss Marple said softly.
"And you have travelled far to stand where he fell?" "He had been foolish," the woman said. "He took what was not his, and others used him for it. I tried to bring him home." Her voice broke, then steadied again. "When I came that morning, I found only snow." Miss Marple's eyes did not move. "The brother was poisoned with brandy. Someone wished to silence him before truth found a listener." The woman flinched. "He said he could mend things." "He meant to return what he took. Perhaps he trusted the wrong helper," Miss Marple said. "A helper with calm hands and warm words." From behind them came the sound of boots. Inspector Craddock approached, his lamp held high. "Miss Marple, is everything all right?" "Yes, Inspector," she said. "This lady has answered a question that waited too long." Craddock turned to the woman. "You're his sister?" She inclined her head. "Margaret Sykes. Did he write to anyone here?" Her voice lowered. "He wrote one letter to the vicar's housekeeper. She was to help him return the stolen money quietly." Craddock frowned. "Mrs. Sims?" "Yes," she said. He trusted her kindness. "She said she would meet him after service." Miss Marple looked down at the snow. "By the fountain." The inspector nodded slowly. "Then it fits." Margaret Sykes sighed.
"I told him not to come."
"But he wished to be forgiven." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Forgiveness can be late, but never lost." The woman turned toward the church door.
"I have said all I can."
"Let the rest be between heaven and him." When she had gone, Craddock exhaled sharply. "So the housekeeper arranged the meeting. That means she must have brought the brandy." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But remember, others poured from that bottle before him." The inspector rubbed his brow. "We'll speak to her at once." The next morning was brittle and clear. The snow shone like glass. At the vicarage, Mrs. Sims opened the door with her usual calm smile. "Good day, Inspector. Tea?" "Later, perhaps," he said. "We'd like a word about Mr. Sykes." She set down her tray. "Terrible business. I told the Reverend it would trouble the parish for weeks." "You corresponded with him?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Sims's smile flickered.
"I may have."
"He wrote asking if I'd take back a sum for the church."
"I told him to come by night so as not to shame the vicar." "Kind of you," Miss Marple said. "And the brandy?"
The woman hesitated. "He asked for warmth."
"I poured a little."
"Nothing more." Craddock's tone was quiet.
"The brandy killed him." She stiffened.
"Impossible."
"I drank from it myself." Miss Marple's eyes were steady.
"Perhaps you poured from the wrong bottle." Mrs. Sims paled. "The vicar keeps two, one for medicine, one for guests." "Where are they now?"
Craddock asked. "In the cupboard," she said faintly. He checked at once.
Both decanters stood side by side.
One half full, clear and amber.
The other nearly empty, its glass dull from handling. Miss Marple looked closer. "See here," she said. "A faint residue inside the neck, greenish like copper." Craddock nodded grimly. "Verdigris. From an old flask, perhaps." "The poison settled there." Mrs. Sims sank into a chair. "I didn't know."
"I only meant to comfort him. I thought he was trembling from cold." Miss Marple's voice was gentle.
"You gave kindness without knowledge. His death was not of malice, but of misunderstanding." Tears welled in the woman's eyes.
"He said he wanted to make it right. I believed him, and he did," Miss Marple said.
"In his way." Craddock closed his notebook softly. "We'll handle the rest, Miss Marple. You've given us what we needed. Outside, the morning sun touched the snow until it gleamed like glass. Miss Marple and the inspector stood in silence. He said, "You were right about the letters." "Letters never lie," she replied. "Only people do?" They walked together toward the square. Children were building a snowman near the fountain, their laughter thin and bright. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine. "Do you think the village will forgive her?"
he asked. "In time," Miss Marple said.
"Forgiveness walks slower than blame, but it always arrives." At the fountain, she paused. The lanterns from the night before still hung there, their candles now cold and white. She touched one lightly, and a drop of melted wax fell to the ice below. "The wax again," she murmured.
"How it threads through all of this." Craddock looked puzzled.
"Meaning?" "Meaning that grief leaves a mark, Inspector. It hardens, but only until the warmth returns." She smiled faintly and turned toward home. The day was clear, the world white and still. Behind her, the church bell began its slow, forgiving chime. Chapter 6. Evening came quiet and white over St. Mary Mead. The air was sharp, and the snow fell in small, patient flakes. The church bells rang softly through the dusk, calling the village to the service for the departed merchant. No one spoke his name aloud now. It drifted like a ghost among the carols. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane, her boots making faint prints in the powder. She carried a candle in a glass holder, its flame bright against the gathering dark. Around her, lanterns bobbed like stars at arm's height as villagers made their way toward the square. The church stood ready, warm light spilling through the narrow windows. Inside, garlands of pine and holly lined the pews. The air smelled of wax and evergreen. Mrs. Bantry and Mrs. Price Ridley whispered near the door, their heads bent close, their voices lowered in solemn curiosity. "I heard they've laid him proper now," Mrs. Bantry said. "Inspector Craddock read a prayer himself. They say his sister's gone back to Upminster," Mrs. Price Ridley replied.
"Left before dawn."
"Couldn't face the talk." Miss Marple passed them with a polite nod. She made her way to the front pew and knelt for a moment. When she rose, she saw the candlelight reflected in the brass of the lectern, steady and clear. Reverend Clement began the service. His voice was calm, the rhythm of his words slow and careful. Snowflakes drifted through the open door and melted soundlessly on the stone. The villagers sang the old hymn, "Abide with me," their breath rising like smoke. Miss Marple's gaze moved along the pews. Tom Ellis sat near the aisle, his hands clasped tightly. Mrs. Sims knelt behind him, pale but composed. Mrs. Clement sat near the vestry, her eyes lowered. Inspector Craddock stood at the back, his coat unbuttoned, his expression thoughtful. Halfway through the hymn, a draught stirred the candles. One flickered out, then another. A woman near the door rose to relight them. As she did, Miss Marple noticed a faint scent that did not belong to wax or pine, a whiff of perfume, unfamiliar, faintly of violets and smoke. Her eyes followed the scent to the choir door. A veiled woman stood there again, motionless, her head bowed. Miss Marple watched her a long moment before returning her gaze to the altar. When the hymn ended, Reverend Clement spoke of mercy and forgiveness. He said that even in the darkest of winters, kindness endures if one keeps the flame of conscience lit. His words echoed softly in the vaulted air. Miss Marple's fingers touched the candle she had brought. Its flame burned small and unwavering. She thought of how the mystery had begun, with laughter and gossip at the Christmas market, and how it had turned, quietly, into grief. After the service, people moved slowly toward the door. The cold rushed in again, carrying the faint scent of snow and wax. Miss Marple waited until the church was nearly empty. Then she rose and walked toward the choir door where the veiled woman had stood. She found nothing there, only a pew cushion still slightly indented, and a thin trail of melted wax leading toward the vestry. She bent to examine it. The wax was greenish-white, tinted faintly by something metallic. "Copper again," she murmured. Inspector Craddock appeared beside her. "Still at work, Miss Marple?" One doesn't stop noticing simply because prayers are said, she replied. He followed her gaze.
You think she was here?
She was, Miss Marple said.
And she brought a candle of her own, Craddock frowned.
Why come back? The case is over. Case is close, she said softly. But hearts do not. He looked around. And what would she want here? To see whether peace truly settles where guilt once stood, Miss Marple answered. They left the church together. Outside the snow was heavier now, covering the prints of those who had gone before. The lamplight glowed golden through the veil of flakes. Mrs. Clement came out behind them, her shawl pulled close.
A fine service, though a sad one, she said.
There is comfort in knowing he rests. Yes, Miss Marple said. Though sometimes peace takes a longer road. Mrs. Clement nodded. You have such faith in patience. Patience is faith, Miss Marple said gently. They walked together toward the vicarage. From a window above, Miss Marple saw a small light flicker once and vanish. The veiled woman, perhaps, saying her own farewell before the night claimed her steps. By the time Miss Marple reached her gate, the snow had risen halfway up the wall. She paused to brush it aside and looked back toward the church. Its tower loomed against the pale sky, a shape of calm and endurance. She carried her candle inside and set it on the mantelpiece. The flame reflected in the window pane, a small twin to the stars beyond. She thought of all that had passed, the brandy, the letters, the false kindness, the quiet deaths of hope and trust, and yet she felt no bitterness. Only a tender understanding of human frailty, warm as the fire beside her. The candle burned lower, its light softening the edges of the room. Miss Marple drew her shawl close and sat quietly until the clock struck 9. Outside, the snow continued without sound. The following morning brought clear skies and a cold, bright sun. The snow glistened where no one had yet walked. Miss Marple opened her curtains and watched light spill over the garden wall. The world looked peaceful again, but she had learned that peace was often a thin crust over restless ground. She dressed warmly and went to the church early. The door stood ajar, letting in a shaft of pale gold light. Inside, Reverend Clement was arranging the hymn books. He looked up, surprised but pleased. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "You rise with the sparrows. They keep decent hours," she said gently. "I came to return a candle I borrowed last night." He smiled faintly.
"So you still keep your mysteries close to wax and flame?" Miss Marple set the candle on the altar rail.
"Light shows more by what it cannot reach," she said softly. He hesitated. "You think the woman who came last night will trouble us again?"
"No," she said.
"Her grief has gone home with her, but grief leaves its scent behind. One must air the room." Outside, footsteps sounded on the frozen path. Constable Jenkins entered, hat in hand. "Morning, Reverend."
"Morning, Miss Marple."
Inspector asked if I'd bring this along. He held out a small paper parcel. Inside were the remains of a candle stub and a short length of ribbon. Miss Marple took them carefully. The wax bore faint green streaks. The ribbon was frayed and smelled faintly of violets. "She left these in the vestry," Jenkins said.
"Perhaps they meant something." "They do," Miss Marple said.
"Everything people leave behind does." She thanked him and watched him go. Then she turned to the vicar. "He won't understand, but this is the end of it." He nodded slowly. "The inspector says he will close the case."
"Accidental poisoning, no malice intended." Miss Marple looked thoughtful.
"Truth is like light through stained glass. It may pass, but it changes colour along the way." Later that day, she met Inspector Craddock in the square. He stood near the fountain, smoking quietly. The snow around it had begun to melt into shallow pools. "All tidy now," he said. "Miss Sims will face no charge." "The brandy was truly meant in kindness," Miss Marple nodded. "Kindness can be as sharp as cruelty when blindfolded." He looked at her with a hint of a smile. "You have a way of turning the simplest acts into parables." "Perhaps," she said. "But parables are only observations given manners." They watched as children carried pine branches toward the church. One boy tripped, scattering needles over the snow. Another laughed and helped him up. Miss Marple smiled. "There," she said, "that is St. Mary Mead. A little foolishness, a little kindness, and the world keeps turning." Craddock sighed. "It's good to see it quiet again." "I'm off to London tomorrow." "Then travel safely," she said. And remember that truth once found must be tended like a fire. It can still go out. He nodded and walked away, his figure fading into the white distance. When the square was empty, Miss Marple moved to the fountain. The ice around its rim had broken in a delicate ring. She bent down and saw her reflection wavering on the thin water. It trembled, then steadied. She thought of the candlelight in the church, of Mrs. Simms's tears, of the veiled sister who had stood so quietly in the snow. Each person had meant to do good, and yet each had carried a part of the harm. That was human nature, she reflected, flawed, unplanned, but still capable of grace. She touched the edge of the fountain lightly. The water was cold, yet the sun on her back was warm. Balance, she thought, is rarely perfect, but it exists. By afternoon, the village returned to its rhythm. The baker's sign creaked again above his door. The post office clock struck the hour. From somewhere far off came the faint ring of children's laughter. Miss Marple walked home. The snow along her path had melted into thin silver ribbons. At her gate she paused, then looked up toward her window. Inside, the candle she had placed on the mantel still burned, steady and clear. She entered her cottage, hung her shawl on the peg, and filled the kettle. The soft hiss of steam met her like an old friend. She set her knitting on her lap and began again, each stitch small and patient. The rhythm soothed her. In each loop of yarn she saw the small pattern of life. Errors corrected, lines mended, loose ends joined quietly together. When the kettle whistled, she poured her tea and added a thin slice of lemon. The scent rose like sunlight after snow. For a long time she sat watching the candle. Its flame made the shadows of her hands dance on the wall. Outside, the world softened into evening. The first star appeared over the church steeple. Miss Marple lifted her cup and smiled.
"Peace returns," she whispered.
But never by chance. Chapter 7. The days that followed were calm, bright, and uneventful. Christmas neared, and St. Mary Mead returned to its gentle routines. The square was swept clean, the market stalls folded and stored. Only the fountain kept its quiet memory beneath the frost. Miss Marple spent her mornings by the window, knitting with steady fingers. The light through the lace curtain touched her hair like frost on silver wire. On the table beside her lay the notebook where she had written each small clue. She read it sometimes as one might read an old letter, not for news, but for meaning. Outside, the postman's whistle sounded faint and cheerful. She smiled. The village, she thought, was healing itself. Yet, healing often leaves behind a scar, and it was in those faint marks that truth could still be read. A knock came at her door. She rose and opened it to find Inspector Craddock. His hat was dusted with snow, his eyes bright from the cold. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I'm afraid I've one last tangle for you." "Then do come in," she said. "Tangling is easier beside a fire." He stepped inside and looked around at her small, neat sitting room. The fire burned evenly, casting a golden light across the worn rug. Craddock took a seat. "We've sorted most of the matter, as you know. Mrs. Sims won't be charged and the sister has gone home. But there's one piece I can't fit, the missing church funds. They were returned, yes, but not by her hand." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Ah, that little coin box that began it all." He nodded. "It was left at the post office during the night."
No name." She folded her hands.
"Return money is still confession, even without words."
"I wonder which conscience softened first." "Tom Ellis swears he knows nothing," Craddock said.
"But Mrs. Price Ridley claims she saw him carrying something under his coat." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Mrs. Price Ridley sees many things, most of them born of boredom." Craddock leaned forward. "Still, you suspect him, don't you?"
"I suspect youth," she said gently.
"It often mistakes loyalty for courage." She rose and fetched the teapot. "You take milk, I think?" "Just a drop," he said. As she poured, she spoke in her calm, even rhythm. Tom loved that choir girl, Elsie. When her name began to circle the village, he feared she'd be blamed for more than tears. He took the coins, perhaps, to force attention elsewhere. Later, when things grew grave, he returned them quietly. Craddock sat back, considering.
"You make it sound almost decent." "It was," she said.
"Foolish, but decent. The sort of decency that stumbles rather than walks, he smiled.
Then you think the matter should rest?
Where truth lies clear, rest follows easily, she said. He looked into the fire a long moment. You have a talent for making sense of nonsense, Miss Marple. Age provides patience, Inspector. Patience reveals pattern. The rest is simply listening to silence, he laughed softly. I'll miss these talks when I return to London. Then you must learn to notice your own patterns, she said. He rose, putting on his gloves. You've earned your peace again, Miss Marple. I'll trouble you no further. Peace is never earned, she replied. It visits those who mind their own business but still keep an ear open. When he left, the house felt still. Miss Marple went to the window and watched him cross the square, his boots cutting neat lines in the snow. Then she returned to her chair, her needles tapping quietly. A few minutes later, another knock came, softer this time. It was Tom Ellis. He stood in the doorway, cap in hand, eyes lowered. I heard the inspector was here, he said. Yes, she said, and he's gone. What troubles you, Tom? He hesitated.
It's over, isn't it?
The market business, the man, all of it. For most, yes, she said. But for you? He looked away.
I just wanted you to know I didn't mean to make such a mess. I only thought...
If they found the money missing, they'd stop talking about Elsie. Miss Marple nodded gently.
And you returned it later?
He swallowed hard. Yes, I left it at the post office after dark. Then all is well, she said softly. Your mistake has already learned its lesson. He looked at her with gratitude. You won't tell? There's nothing left to tell, she said. Go and help the vicar set up the nativity. He needs strong arms more than guilty ones. He smiled weakly and went on his way. When he was gone, Miss Marple sat for a while in the hush that followed. The fire crackled softly and the light trembled on her knitting needles. She took up her notebook once more and wrote a final line. Truth finished, kindness begun. Then she closed it and laid it beside her tea. Outside, the snow began again, slow and unhurried. Each flake fell as if measuring its distance to earth with care. She watched until the window clouded with frost, her face reflected faintly in the glass. The wrinkles of age and wisdom blended with the falling snow beyond, both intricate, both calm. She whispered, another winter kept. Evening came early again, soft and clear. A hush settled over St. Mary Mead, as if the whole village had drawn a single quiet breath. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting folded neatly beside her, and the faint smell of tea leaves drifted from the tray on the table. The events of the past week passed through her mind in calm order. She saw them as one might see a finished piece of embroidery, each colour distinct, each stitch deliberate, even the mistakes lending meaning, the merchant's greed, the housekeeper's pity, the boy's confusion, the girl's fear. Every thread had been drawn through the same cloth. Outside, sleigh bells jingled faintly as children played on the lane. Their laughter rose and fell soft as birds at dusk. Miss Marple smiled. Life, she thought, was too fond of repeating its small joys to dwell forever in sorrow. A knock at the door roused her. It was Mrs. Bantry, wrapped in her thick shawl and carrying a covered dish. Jane, I thought you might like a little stew, she said. You've been shut up in here for days, Miss Marple smiled warmly. You're kind as ever, Dolly. Come in before the chill catches you. Mrs. Bantry set the dish on the table and looked around. So it's all finished now, is it? The talk, the gossip, the dreadful business. As finished as human stories ever are, Miss Marple said gently. The inspector has gone back to London. Mrs. Sims rests easier. The boy helps at the church again, Mrs. Bantry sighed. It's remarkable how quiet things seem after a scandal. Quiet, Miss Marple said, is simply talk that has learned to whisper. They shared tea in comfortable silence. The fire gave off a steady glow and the clock ticked in patient rhythm. Mrs. Bantry leaned back at last. You know, Jane, you were right from the start. It was all too tidy to be chance. Tidy things often hide the dust beneath them, Miss Marple said. And human nature has no real fondness for cleanliness of motive. Mrs. Bantry laughed softly. You do have a way with words. Sometimes I think you see right through us all. Not through, Miss Marple said. Only across? When Mrs. Bantry had gone, Miss Marple tidied away the tea things and returned to her chair. The room was quiet except for the faint rustle of the curtains as wind stirred outside. The snow had stopped, leaving a night sky of perfect clarity. She took up her knitting again, but did not begin. Instead, she watched the firelight play across the wall, flickering like thought itself, constant in movement, never in rest. The pattern of the village, she reflected, was much like her own knitting, each person a thread, each day a row. Mistakes corrected in patience, sometimes hidden, sometimes left for memory. She wondered how many such winters she had seen, and how many more she might. Her gaze drifted to the window. Across the lane, she could see the vicarage windows glowing softly. Inside, shadows moved. Reverend Clement reading aloud, Mrs. Clement folding linen, perhaps Tom helping light the lamps. All ordinary, all dear. She thought of how swiftly fear had passed through those same walls only days ago, how quickly trust had returned. It was a pattern she knew well, the brief storm, the quiet mending, the simple tea that followed. Later that night, she wrote a note in her journal, her script small and even. The world sins by accident and repents by habit. Between the two there is room for understanding. She closed the book and set it beside her lamp. The candle on the mantel burned steadily, its flame without tremor. She liked that small, dependable light in a world too quick to darken. A soft tap came at the window. She rose and drew back the curtain. Outside stood Tom Ellis, holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He lifted it shyly when she opened the door.
"It's just a little gift," he said.
"For Christmas. From Elsie and me. We wanted to thank you." "You've no need, Tom," she said. He smiled. "Maybe not, but we wanted to." She accepted it and wished him good night. When she unwrapped it later, she found a new ball of wool, soft and grey, with a note pinned to it. "To mend what's worth keeping." Miss Marple smiled, and her eyes shone briefly in the candlelight. She placed the wool in her basket and sat back down. Outside, the moon hung clear above the rooftops. Somewhere a dog barked once and fell silent. The village slept again in its quiet rhythm. Miss Marple began to knit with the new wool, the thread smooth between her fingers. Each stitch formed neatly, without tension. She felt a calm settle over her like snow upon a field. Soon her hands slowed, and she rested them in her lap. The fire dimmed to a low red glow. Her thoughts drifted not toward puzzles, but toward peace, the gentle kind that needs no answer. She whispered to the quiet room, "Kindness must be tended like a fire, or it fades." And with that thought, she folded her work and reached to snuff the candle. Its smoke curled upward, soft and blue. Outside, frost gathered once more on the panes, weaving delicate patterns of its own. Candlelight, and so, dear listener, a corpse at the Christmas market draws to its quiet close. The candle's flame glows steadily again. Its light rests gently on the revealed truth. In St. Mary Mead, peace returns, and Miss Marple's knitting resumes. Each stitch reflects the tangled hearts of humankind. Until next time, dear listener, another secret fades by candlelight.